Good morning, and thank you for joining me on the path to liberty. It's Wednesday, September 22nd, 2021. And lately I've been thinking more and more about mass, almost mindless compliance and obedience to government that we see, well, really all around the world, but we're really focused more here locally. And I've done a number of episodes recently, of course, talking about strategy to nullify federal mandates or various federal programs, and then even things to be wary of. Stuff that politicians say or claim to be resistance. It sounds like it, but at the end of the day, they're really only they're just grandstanding. They're fake. They're pretending. So on this episode, I want to explore the idea that beyond bad strategy, there's something deeper that we're facing. And it's just kind of, I'm going to flow with some of my own thoughts and maybe share. And I've got a bunch of quotes from founders and old revolutionaries to talk about this. And something that we're deeper that we're facing, more difficult to overcome. And of course, we've got fear, but there's also a habit of what the founders and old revolutionaries called passive obedience and non-resistance. But first of all, before getting to that, my name is Michael Bolden. We broadcast live every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 9:30 a.m. Pacific time from here in my home office and studio in downtown Los Angeles for the 10th Amendment Center. Our show homepage has everything you need to follow this program, all the archives on individual episodes like this one. I will link to the stuff that I talk about so you can read and learn more in context on your own time. I'm really just scratching the surface, and the more that you read and learn on your own time, the better. You can find all the different platforms we're on. Of course, we live stream on the mainstream ones like Facebook and YouTube and Twitter and Twitch, but we also live stream at Odyssey.com, which is really awesome, decentralized and censorship resistant like no other, at least so far. We are also archive video at places like Gab TV and Minds and MeWe and Brighteon and BitChute and BitTube and everywhere that we can think of, including Rumble more recently. We started uploading to Rumble as well. And then, of course, we have the audio-only podcast edition, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, TuneIn, Podbean, and more, plus our membership program you'll find over there where you can put your financial faith behind our work for as little as $2 a month. Again, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. A quick hello to everyone out in the live chat while we allow people another moment or so to get notifications to join us on the live stream. Liberty Revolutionary, good to see you, buddy. Cheriton Farmer, Missouri Liberty Alliance. Tim Martin in Arizona. John Adams in Arkansas. Dixie Strong in Alabama. Dave Simmons here in Southern California. I'm in LA. We're almost neighbors, I guess, at that point. Dwayne in Washington State. Patricia Dance says, greetings. Great title. It's What's With All the Obedience Anyway, right? Tyler B., good to see you. Been a while. Blue North, Clay Kent, Bob Landry, Guneye, Brody, Michael Lure, Shane Lackey, Rachel Menard, Robert Levi, and everyone else. Clay Kent, I think I already said hello. MRGF. Thank you all for being here, whether this is your first episode or you've been here for every single one since day one. Let's start out with some warnings and some thoughts about non-compliance or, well, I guess passive obedience and actually non-resistance, going all the way back to James Otis Jr. Here in 1764, in The Rights of the British Colonies Asserted and Proved, he put it this way: he that would palm the doctrine of unlimited passive obedience and non-resistance upon mankind, and thereby, or by any other means, serve the cause of the pretender. That's some kind of king inside baseball, but serve the cause of the pretender is not only a fool and a knave, but a rebel against common sense, as well as the laws of God, of nature, and his country. So this notion of just complete and utter, well, government says do this, and I have to do it because government says so. This is really, I've talked quite a bit recently, and I've got a speech that I'm going to be doing for the LPMC in Washington, D.C. next month, talking a little bit about this evolution in the idea, the notion of sovereignty in American political thought, which really started, we can go back to James Otis Jr. in 1761 as the beginning of the controversy between America and Great Britain in his argument against the writs of assistance, where he said, an act against the Constitution is void. Of course, it was the unwritten British Constitution. He wasn't talking about something that hadn't even been drafted yet many years later. But this was the notion, if you're talking about a government that can do whatever it wants, and you have to obey it because government has final authority. This is the belief that government is sovereign. Maybe government was blessed or ordained by God to tell people what to do. This view that government was sovereign. And it was a shift in the Americans during that time in the early days of the Revolution, starting probably with James Otis Jr. Really, he learned from other people as well, but he popularized this. And of course, John Adams' notes on it did as well. But switching it from, well, it doesn't matter what they do. We have something else that's higher than what the government has to say. And we're talking about laws of nature, laws of God, and the laws of his country, his constitution. An act against the constitution is void. The people are sovereign. Going further, he said in another paper, this one writing anonymously as Freeborn American in April of 1767, he points out that a free government, sometimes that might be an oxymoron, a free government never degenerated into tyranny all at once. It is the work of years. There is nothing, said James Otis, nothing. And he's not saying this is one of the worst. Absolutely nothing, however, will in the end more surely work the destruction of liberty than a prevailing opinion that it is better tamely to submit than nobly assert and vindicate our privileges. James Otis was certainly not alone. I've got a couple of other examples here that I wanted to share with you as well. Here's John Adams back when he was one of the good guys, when he was the Atlas of Independence. Well, maybe not known as that yet, but here in 1765, his dissertation on the canon and feudal law. Of course, I'm going to link to all these weird papers that government schools don't teach about this stuff. You have to go out and find this information on your own. We have access to a whole host of awesome stuff if we want to look for it. Here, John Adams in 1765, he referred to passive obedience and non-resistance as the most mischievous of all doctrines. The most mischievous, at least in 1765, he thought that was the worst, the notion of passive obedience and non-resistance. And it wasn't just the more famous founders and old revolutionaries. There were a number of sermons about this. And there's actually a book about the political sermons of the founding era that I'm not citing on this one, but you'll actually find where there were some sermons in support of the notion, well, the king is ordained by God, and therefore you have to have passive obedience is your duty. But there was a lot in the other direction. Here, for example, Samuel West, and this was from a book, American Political Writing During the Founding Era, 1760 to 1805. Of course, I'll link to the whole book where you can read it for free at libertyfund.org. This is Samuel West, a sermon on the right to rebel against governors. It was his election day sermon of 1776. Notice he wasn't saying, I mean, maybe he did, and I should read through the whole thing again. I was just reading through little clips of it. But he wasn't really focused heavily on vote one side or the other. He was talking about rebelling against governors on even election day. Here's how he put it. The doctrine of non-resistance and unlimited passive obedience to the worst of tyrants could never have found credit among mankind had the voice of reason been hearkened to for a guide. You can't actually look to this view of passive obedience, especially unlimited. Now, passive obedience can be a strategic choice because, of course, you don't want to just, blow it out at every single turn. Not everything is the hill to die on. You have to be smart about this. That's how Thomas Jefferson put it in a letter to James Madison the day after the Kentucky resolutions of 1798, formalizing the principles of nullification passed in Kentucky that year. The next day, he said, we should hold to all the principles in this, but we should push as far as events will render prudent. A smart person, a good leader, recognizes you have to have smart strategy. So, of course, we're talking about unlimited passive obedience, but in many ways, I would say we have unlimited passive obedience today and non-resistance, because otherwise we wouldn't be living under the largest government in the history of the planet. I mean, and it's not even close. Anyways, he says you couldn't have any reason. If reason were our guide, this doctrine would not have found any credit at all. Of course, I think as a pastor, he was recognized. Now, this is not sermons and pastors and religion and all that stuff is not really my expertise, but I find a great deal of interest in how from the pulpit at the time of the revolution in 1776, there were debates over how to deal with government, whether you should comply or refuse to comply. And you don't really see that too often today. He says such a doctrine would immediately have been discerned to be contrary to the natural law. Of course, this is a natural law, natural rights foundation again, that something is superior to government. Government is ordained to do certain things. Some people say to protect you. Some people will say to, carry out regulation, whatever it may be. But you can't have unlimited obedience and submission to it because that is a rejection to everything else. Now, of course, this carried forward to the founding generation and even after that. Here's Thomas Jefferson. This is literally the first line, the first sentence of his Kentucky resolutions of 1798, calling for nullification and resistance to the hated Alien and Sedition Act signed by John Adams. I like pointing out John Adams used to be the good guy back before independence and probably into a few years. And Mercy Otis Warren, who I'm going to cite in a few moments here, or in a few minutes, she talked about how he was one of the best. And even though his character, his personal character stayed the same, she thought he transitioned to be a monarchist by the time he got into office. And of course, he signed that horrible, horrible attack, one of the worst laws in American history, a series of laws, the Alien and Sedition Acts. It prompted Thomas Jefferson to draft this resolution against it for Kentucky. Here's the first sentence. The several states are not united on the principle of unlimited submission to their general government. So again, this notion of unlimited passive obedience and submission as individuals, and then states as representatives of the people of those states as a bulwark, kind of a stand between, an interposing agent between the people and their general government, the federal or central government today. The first sentence, this is a paraphrase. And then we have Walt Whitman's caution some years later. This was first published in 1860, the first edition of his Leaves of Grass. Walt Whitman's caution is one of my favorite poems ever. He said it this way, and I've got the original in his handwriting up on the screen. I will link to that in the show notes so you can check it out and save it if you'd like as well. He said, to the states, or any one of them, or any city of the state, resist much, obey little. Once unquestioning obedience, once fully enslaved. Once fully enslaved, no nation, state, city of this earth ever after resumes its liberty. Sorry, I'm having a little trouble reading that. Once again, once fully enslaved, no nation, state, city of this earth ever afterward resumes its liberty. So resist much, obey little. Of course, Whitman, John Greenleaf Whittier, Spooner, Lysander Spooner, and many others, they were talking about resistance to the hated Fugitive Slave Act, pro-slavery federal laws. They wanted to nullify and oppose this. Whitman actually specifically says the nullification referenced by Mr. Whittier, that was nullification of the Federal Fugitive Slave Act. He said this is loyalty to goodness. Again, there's a higher moral standard than what government tells us we're supposed to do. Now, this is the exact kind of thing that we have been pushing and building on, creating a foundation for people, individuals, localities, and states to stand up and oppose, not just have blind obedience. And we cover all the main efforts on that in our annual State of the Nullification Movement report. I was hoping to have the new one for 2021 done by now. We're a little behind schedule, but we've got a full if you've read this on a year-to-year basis, the first section where we explain the history and the strategy, the legal basis, and how it's been used in the past has been totally revamped. This is one of the best pieces of work I think that Mike Meharry and I have ever done, and I think we've got the first section done on that. And then the second half, we see how that's being put into practice on various issues today, whether it's prohibition on plants or prohibition on the right to keep and bear arms, on surveillance, on health care, all kinds of stuff, asset forfeiture, police state. That's over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. And as I mentioned at the outset, there's absolutely nothing. Like, if you want to put your financial faith behind our work to help us, please don't feel any obligation to do this. But there is absolutely nothing that helps us build on this foundation brick by brick, person by person than the financial faith and support of our members. That's 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. Now, while we're seeing more and more nullification efforts today, we're seeing some kind of glimmer of hope. And in fact, I would say we're seeing more of this than we've seen at any time in history. But there's also, you have to think it's in comparison with the largest government in the history of the world. Sooner or later, people are just going to recognize, like, okay, well, they just keep passing stuff. They can't enforce all of it. We've seen this happen on cannabis. We've seen it happen on immigration. We're starting to see some openings, some cracks on this in regards to the right to keep and bear arms in places like Missouri. I saw Missouri Liberty Alliance and Liberty Revolutionary out in the chat who have been doing a lot of great grassroots activism to push that type of thing, along with people like Ron Calzone. We also saw an effort like this in Arizona to stop complying with gun control as well. But we need to expand on this. And I think we're really just scratching the surface. So again, we wouldn't be living under the largest government in the history of the world if this kind of resistance was the standard, was the norm. And we have some pretty big things to overcome. Of course, fear, as I mentioned right at the beginning. Fear, as John Adams, back when he was a good guy in 1776, I think this was in April of 76, he said, fear is the foundation of most governments. Just cross off the word most in that statement is perfect. Fear is the foundation. Now, of course, there's different types of fear. People are fearful of stuff happening to them. They're afraid that if you have liberty, then they're not going to, some people, maybe themselves, are not going to get what they want out of life. They're also afraid of getting hurt, whether it's something that's visible or invisible. Something's out to get them. Sometimes it's a terrorist. Sometimes it's something in the air. Sometimes it's from your breath. Who knows what it may be? But people are very fearful of things. Sometimes it's justified. James Madison, of course, he at one time wrote that the loss of liberty at home is really, it's a universal principle that it's to be charged against danger, real or pretended, from abroad. So that fear can be based on something real. But what people do when they're afraid is they run to government to protect them. It doesn't matter how many times the government has abused them, their friends, their family, or people around the world. It doesn't matter how many millions of people its policies have murdered, really. They still run to them because they're scared. But then, of course, there's also a fear of actually resisting government. People are afraid of actually doing things that are counter to government because they think government is all powerful and government's going to get them. So they don't want to risk stuff. And of course, again, we have to be smart about opposing government because government is a violent beast. And again, the largest government in the history of the world can bring the most amount of violence and pressure on people, businesses, and the like. But this really brings me to something else. On Monday's episode, I was reading through a passage from Mercy Otis Warren's great History of the Rise, Progress, and Termination of the American Revolution, and I was reminded of another important passage in that book of how people have an almost habitual blind obedience to authority, and it happens in all countries and all ages. And I want to read through this. It's kind of a long piece. I don't normally just read long paragraphs. Well, I guess sometimes I do. But I think it's really important to consider this, and I hope you guys will think about it because this is part of what we're up against as well. And here's how she put it. She was talking about, just as she was getting into this segment, this is from volume 1 of that book. I will link to it in the show notes, of course, so you can read it in context. But she was talking about how, well, there were some things. There was the Stamp Act. You saw some level of resistance. But we know after the Stamp Act, this is a quick aside, when they repealed it, so there was resistance to it. There was nullification on a colonial, even law enforcement level. There was even a court in Maryland, for example, that said locals did not have to comply with it. So there were all the strategies that we use today for nullification. Individual, local, city, state level actions to oppose something. But once they repealed it, because they couldn't enforce it because of that resistance, once they repealed it, they passed something else that claimed the power to bind the colonies in all cases whatsoever. So it was a real slap in the face. So she's pointing out that, yes, we saw pockets of resistance, but it wasn't complete in 1765. And she said this, "It is indeed true that resentment had in several instances arisen to outrage." That's one of those examples. "And that the most unwarrantable excesses had been committed on some occasions, which gave grounds for unfavorable representations." Translated, short version, Sometimes government did stuff that you found a bunch of resistance to it, and then we were able to get that repealed or basically nullified in practice. She said, yet it must be acknowledged that the voice of the people seldom breathes universal murmur. But when the insolence or the oppression of their rulers extorts the bitter complaint. And in fact, Murray Rothbard, in his great 4-volume, now 5-volume history of Conceived in Liberty is what it's called, history of the founding of America through the Revolution, through the Constitution, and beyond. He talked about how true revolutionary movements rarely have a universal murmur. People oppose government for various reasons and various goals, and sometimes they become united even though they have different end goals, because it's like the enemy of my enemy is my friend. And we saw that happen, for example, and Rothbard covers it in that book, in Virginia and elsewhere, where you found two groups of people who normally were at odds with each other in resistance to the state. Going further, here's Mercy Otis Warren again. On the contrary, there is a certain supineness which generally overspreads the multitude and disposes mankind to submit quietly to any form of government, rather than to be at the expense and hazard of resistance. People don't want to risk their lives, their family, their income. Of course, at a time when when you have a government as big as it is, and it does as much stuff as it does, and it has set the precedent to do so much more in the future, it's very risky, of course, to stand up to them. They're devaluing the purchasing power of their fiat money. They make it more difficult. You don't have, single working family, single person home working homes. You have more and more people. It's harder and harder to earn a living through inflation. The printing press has driven prices up. And so, of course, there's more to risk in a situation like that. So it disposes mankind in all ages, he's saying, generally will submit quietly to whatever form of government exists, rather than be at the expense and hazard of resistance. They become attached to ancient modes by habits of obedience, though the reins of authority are sometimes held by the most rigorous hand. Thus we have seen in all ages the many become the slaves of the few, preferring the wretched tranquility of inglorious ease. They patiently yield to despotic masters until awakened by multiple wrongs to the feelings of human nature. In other words, she's really just saying, generally, people will put up with as much garbage as government throws at them, as long as their day-to-day life is generally functional. But sometimes government just government always keeps going. At some point, sometimes government keeps pushing to the level where people across any political spectrum are saying enough is enough. And you find those groups that don't breathe with a universal murmur on their day-to-day lives doing so in rejection of that centralized power. And that's how she summed it up. That type, they're awakened by multiplied wrongs to the feelings of human nature, which when once aroused to a consciousness of the native freedom and equal rights of man, ever revolts at the idea of servitude. But it's not something that's very common throughout history. Here's how Samuel Adams put it in his famous, it should be famous, American Independence speech. He gave it on the day that they finally were going to be signing, and it may have been signed the day after the Declaration of Independence. We look at July 4th as the big day, but really it wasn't signed, I think, until August 2nd. Here's him giving a speech on independence in support of that declaration. And of course, he put it this way. This is a very famous one. I think a lot of people know the quote, at least, even if they don't know where it came from. If ye love wealth better than liberty, the tranquility of servitude, than the animated contest of freedom, go from us in peace. We ask not your counsels or arms. Crouch down and lick the hands which feed you. May your chains set lightly upon you, and may posterity forget that ye were our countrymen. Now, I'm not sure if I've got a point to sum this up, other than I think we are facing two really big, very difficult hurdles. I mean, with you and I think it's a little bit different because we recognize that government isn't supposed to be doing almost anything that it does today. And we understand the strategies. It takes resistance. That doesn't mean we're able to do this in every moment of our lives. I know I can't. I live in fear of getting prosecuted if I'm going to stand up, obviously, at every single turn. But there are certain things that we can do quietly until we have enough numbers. And then we have to get a little bit louder about those things that we do over time and build the numbers. Sooner or later, someone's got to take one for the team. And I know that's what one of the guys who was prosecuted under following the Kansas Second Amendment Protection Act from some years ago. I think it was Kettler or Cox. I can't remember who did this. But one of them was making sound suppressors in violation of the National Firearms Act of 1934. And they were following the state law that said if you make it in state and you sell it in state and then it's not interstate commerce. Well, they were prosecuted under this. The other person was buying. They got some fines and maybe some community service. But the person who was making it got the little stiffer sentences, not even as bad as it could have been. Specifically said, look, I knew this was a risk, but someone has to take one for the team. People have to start sticking their neck out for liberty. And I think that's really the message here, whether it's from James Otis or Thomas Jefferson, Samuel Adams, Mercy Otis Warren, and even John Adams. I hope you guys found this interesting. Hope it was educational. I hope it gives you something to think about. Let me take a quick look over at the live chat and see if there is some interesting stuff here. Liberty Revolutionary, Samuel Adams' speech at the Pennsylvania State House. Yes, that's the American Independence speech. I will link to the full text of that in the show notes over at 10thamendmentcenter.com/path to liberty. Salt Laker says sheep must be treated with caution. Of course, we live in a snitch society, and there used to be an old saying, I guess, snitches get stitches, but I guess not really more. Mercy Bucket says you can see a little spark of recognition there and a glimmer of hope. And absolutely, and I don't want to downplay that at all, because in our State of the Nullification Movement report, which I talked about briefly earlier in the show, and I will link to in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/report. Of course, we actually see more state and local nullification and resistance to federal overreach than at any time in history. But I don't know if the curve for the resistance is going up as fast as the size of government. So government, I think, is growing much faster than the resistance is. So I think in the long, or at least in the short run, short to medium term, no matter what we do, I think it's very likely that things are going to get worse. I know it's not probably what a lot of people want to hear. I know a lot of people want to hear, oh, all we got to do is vote these people out, or we just got to do this level of resistance. We have to pass this local thing in enough cities, or we have to pass this thing on a state level. We got to have a convention of state, whatever it may be. We're going to fix everything with this silver bullet, and everything's going to be great. But I think that's a lie. And to me, my view, if I'm just looking at the size of government and the speed of its growth, in comparison to the speed of resistance. Now, it's possible once you get to kind of a critical mass, it can catch up and maybe pass up the speed of growth. But that's not going to be a pretty sight. And Thomas Jefferson said, we're not going to be translated from despotism to liberty in a featherbed. That doesn't mean it's going to be an all-out battle, but people are, when they take chances for liberty, they're risking a lot. They can get prosecuted, get thrown behind bars, thrown in a cage for literally what they own or what they choose to do with their own lives without even harming others. So, Mercy, you're absolutely right. You can see a little spark of recognition there and a glimmer of hope. Sheep are the enemy. Yeah, it's a very good point. Of course, government is bad. Government is bad. It doesn't matter whether you were going to vote for Team A or Team B. We'd still be living under the largest government in the history of the world. There's no reduction, no matter what side. So all that election garbage, what a waste of time. Shane Lackey makes a good point here. Death by trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions and trillions of cuts. And that's what they've been doing for a long time. And Salt Lakers as well. Government couldn't do what it does without millions of obedient. Missouri Liberty Alliance, thanks for the shout out. Thanks for the great activism that you've been doing there in Missouri. We're working hard to shut down federal tyranny in Missouri. A lot of good folks fighting here. And I've got to mention my friend, my longtime friend, Ron Calzone, who has really done great work in Missouri for a long time. He was actually, when I first met him, I think it was 2009 or 2010, he was actually one of the first people that was doing activism to use the 10th Amendment to nullify Obamacare. And this was before we had ever even talked. So this guy really understands the strategy. Missouri First is another great organization. Please reach out to them if you live in that state. Or if you don't, look to see the approaches that they've been doing in Missouri, because they're making a lot of great strides. There's a long, long way to go. Don't get me wrong. Every single state in the country, when it comes to liberty, is a garbage pit. They may be better on one thing, but once you find something that they're good on in one state, they're much worse on another thing. Now, of course, I mean, I live in California, so like, I don't know if I should be throwing stones, but I think you get the overall picture. If we were living in the land of the free, things would be far, far different in every state of the union. Anyways, I hope you guys found this interesting. If you and educational, I will link to all this stuff in the show notes, 10thamendmentcenter.com/path-to-liberty. Please continue to leave comments, especially in the archive. That really helps tell the algorithm to show the program to more people. Plus, of course, reviews on Apple Podcasts or any podcast platform. Smashing the like button, getting notifications, all that stuff. Again, triggering the algorithm, tells the mainstream platform, show the program to more people. We're reaching more people than I ever thought possible. And thank you so much for that help. And again, that membership program, 10thamendmentcenter.com/members. If you've got $2 a month to spare, I would greatly appreciate any consideration you can give to supporting our work. Thank you so much for being here. I hope you have a great day, and I'll see you next time here on the Path to Liberty.